Hi everyone. In today's video I'm going to cover the exchange variation of the Slav defense, a variation which most Slav and semi-Slav defense players fear most, and hate facing most, not because it's deadly, but because it's boring. There is a phrase, I don't know who said it, that the exchange Slav takes the fun out of the Slav, and that's partially true. Because if both sides know what they're doing, the opening is perfectly symmetrical, it's a draw with perfect play if neither side makes a mistake, and the only difference is that white will always be that one tempo up, and he will always have that first extra move, which will either enable him to make decisions and deviations from the theory and from the regular play of developing pieces, and B, he will always be faster to accomplish what he wants if they keep doing the same thing. So if black just keeps copying white's moves, then white is always going to be one move faster. Okay, now let's get into the opening. After d4 and d5, black plays classically, symmetrically, c4 the queen's gambit, and the Slav c6. White can take the pawn, exchange the pawn, and have a symmetrical position with the tempo up. So he plays c takes d5. One thing I would like to note before we start is that queen takes d5 is not playable, even though it avoids the exchange Slav, because that allows knight c3 with tempo. The queen then either has to go back to d8 or has to go to a5. In both cases, white can just expand with d4 now, and black has taken away a square for his knight on c6. The queen is the only developed piece, and it's kind of misplaced, and white now has a broad center. So against the exchange variation, black simply has to recapture with the c-pawn. One thing I would like to add is that it's possible for white to delay the exchange if he wants to. So after d4, d5, c4, c6, he can play knight f3 or knight c3. And once black plays the move knight f6, which is the most common move here, white can then exchange off. Once again, taking with the knight is not good because e4, you always want to take with the pawn. And now we have a delayed exchange variation in which white has played knight f3, black has played knight f6. After knight to f3, and if black plays knight to f6, white doesn't really want to play knight to c3, because then he doesn't really have the exchange variation anymore or possibility to enter it, because after black plays the move e6, white takes. Now black is not going to take with the c-pawn, having a bad bishop. He's going to take with the e-pawn, and we are going to have a classical Carlsbad pawn structure with white having a pawn majority on the king side, black having a pawn majority on the queen side, and white is going to go for a minority attack, but that's a topic for a different video. So coming back to the exchange variation, what's the reason players with black don't like it? Well, if white knows what he's doing, and it's not that hard to learn what you should do here, it's impossible for black to gain an advantage out of the opening. It's impossible. And even though that's true with most openings, with the exchange Slav, it's almost impossible to complicate things if white knows what he is doing. So if you want to kill counterplay for black, the exchange Slav is a perfect opening. What both sides can do here is mess up very early on, and there are some possibilities for tricks and quick attacks if you're not careful. But once again, if you learn what you should be doing, it should be fine and safe. I'm just going to show you what the usual game in the exchange Slav looks like. So after d4, d5, c4, c6, takes. I'm now going to show you what's usually played on the highest level. And this video, as opposed to other theoretical videos, is not going to be endless variations in which I talk about what you should do in each. The exchange Slav is a system. It's not an opening full of variations. So it doesn't make sense to learn exact move orders. You need to learn the patterns, you need to learn where your pieces go, and you need to learn how to punish possible mistakes. So, what white wants to do in this opening is develop his pieces, his knights to f3 and c3, his bishop to f4, and then play e3. You don't want to play the move e3 before you've played the move bishop to f4, because then your bishop is going to be trapped on c1. So white starts with knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, both sides develop sensibly, bishop to f4, and black can now choose either e6, which is inferior, or bishop to f5, which is the main move. Now, most games are continuing like this. bishop to f4, e6. Most games are continuing like this after e6, with e3, bishop d6, challenging the bishop. Now in this position, black has challenged the f4 bishop. White has three options. He can take, he can retreat to g3 and take with the h pawn if black takes, or he can simply develop his bishop, his light squared bishop to d3 and allow black to take. If black after bishop f4 plays bishop f5, which is a more popular move, now the games are going to look like this. e3, e6, bishop d3, takes, queen takes, bishop to d6, takes, queen takes, castles, castles. Do you notice something in this position? It's completely symmetrical, but white is a tempo up. So what's the point of playing the Exchange Slav for white if 100% of the games, believe it or not, from this position, which is fairly common, 93% of the games end in a draw on master level. So what's the point? The point is that you can't have a disadvantage if you play carefully. So it's a risk-free opening on the high level, and especially if black is the higher rated player, it will provoke him to try something risky, and playing something risky always gives white the advantage because he's that one move up. Now before I go on, I'm just going to show you one common theme in this opening which you need to remember, and that's the problem with the moves queen to b3 and queen to b6, and why they sometimes can, sometimes cannot be played, and how to react to them. Now I'm 5 days late with this video. I wanted to record it 5 days ago, but then I played a training game in the Exchange Slav. My opponent played a setup which I didn't know, and that made me think. That setup was after c takes d5. He played the early bishop f4. I played the move knight c6, and he played e3. And I thought, well, I really should be punishing this, and I didn't know how this can be played. I'm just going to show you what I'm talking about. After e3, I played the move queen b6, thinking that, well, since he played e3, his bishop can no longer defend from the d2 square. His b2 pawn is weak. This diagonal is weak. The a5, e1 diagonal is weak. And you can imagine a position in which after black plays the move e5, the bishop could be coming to b4 and the white king could be in trouble. So those were my thoughts. My opponent defended with the move queen d2, which is not bad or terminal, but it just doesn't seem like a good option. And at this point, I thought black had a huge advantage, and that is why I decided to take 5 more days to study the Exchange Slav. So in this position, white is in fact perfectly fine. He had an even better option than queen to d2, because queen to b6 is not a threat at all. After queen b6, you can simply play the move knight to c3. And of course, if queen takes b2, you can just take on d5, and there are no problems in this position. As it turns out, after something like e6, white is still not in trouble. In this position, there have been several games played. Bishop d3, a3, and rook c1 have been played. Both are fine. 2 games ended in white's favor. 1 game ended in a draw. So queen b6 in this position was not a threat at all. So that's one situation in which queen to b6 just didn't work, and it looked very tempting. If we look at one of the more popular lines, let's say white tries knight c3 first, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop f4. You might be wondering, well, okay, after bishop f4, white is leaving the b2 pawn undefended. Let's play queen to b6. Well, if you play queen to b6, there's once again absolutely no problem for white. He doesn't have to defend. Now, if you don't know the variations, you might be tempted to play something like rook b1, queen c1, queen c2, queen d2, even retreating the bishop back or playing b3. Now, all of those moves would be unnecessary because you can simply continue with the move a3. And if black takes on b2, you now play knight a4, and black is in serious trouble. After the move queen b5, which is the only move, and now bishop to d2, you are now threatening to trap the queen with the move e3. And if you look at it, it's not that easy to defend this. In fact, the only move is queen a6, otherwise you lose the queen. After queen a6 and e3, black is now forced to play the move b5 to defend the queen, and you simply continue with knight c5. And in this position, if I turn on the engine, you can see that white is clearly winning. So that's just one trap. And if you play the Exchange Slav, inexperienced players are who don't know the position are either going to waste a ton of time here trying to calculate whether queen b6 works, which I did in my training game after bishop f4 e3, or B, they're just going to play queen b6 thinking they can take on b2, and after they play queen b6 and you play the move a3, which stops bishop b4 and knight b4 and stops the retreat of the queen to a3. If they take, you just win a quick game. Now, another thing I would like to point out, well, why doesn't white try the same thing? After bishop f5, which is the most popular move for black, what's wrong with queen b3 for white? Surely the same variation doesn't work. Well, if black plays the move a6, then queen takes b7 is risky, but black has an even better move. Black can play the move knight to a5 immediately, and now what does the queen do? You can't take. You can play a check on a4 or on b5. In either case, the knight is retreating to c3. To c6, I'm sorry. If you play a check on b5, then even bishop to d7 might be a good move. But okay, queen a4 check is the best move, even though it's a bad move. Knight c6, and now if e3, knight h5, and all of a sudden you've just lost your bishop pair. You are about to be faced with the move b5, and black is not better here. He doesn't have such a winning advantage, but white has wasted a very important tempo on queen b3 and ended up trading off his dark squared bishop, which has now made these squares quite strong for black when he puts his bishop on d6. So those kinds of moves simply don't work. So let's say after bishop f4 and bishop f5, white isn't tempted to play the move queen to b3, which isn't good. He simply plays e3. Now, black should, of course, play the move e6 once again. But once again, let's ask ourselves, well, now the bishop is on f4 and the pawn has been played to e3, which means that it's impossible to retreat the bishop to d2. Why not queen b6 now? Well, if queen b6 now, putting pressure on the pawn, there is a deadly move here for white, and that's the move bishop b5. After bishop b5, it's really not easy to react to this for black. First of all, white is going to castle on his next move, and black needs to do something. The best and the most active move is a6, and now you might be surprised with what the continuation is. You just take on a6 on c6. And now, if the queen takes, that doesn't have to be calculated for a long time, just knight to e5. The queen doesn't have that many squares. After queen to e6, which is the best move, you just play queen to b3, putting pressure on the pawn. You don't have that many options to defend, and all of a sudden, white's position is very dominant. After something like queen to c8, now once again, you can do a lot of stuff. You have a knight on e5, your bishop is on f4, very active. You have a very active knight on c3. You can basically win this pawn on d5 in a couple of moves. If I turn on the engine, this is +3, +2, +3. So you are basically playing for piece activity. And after bishop takes c6, if you play the correct move, b takes c6, then white simply castles. And if, for example, let's say queen takes b2. After queen takes b2, rook c1, white now has knight a4 coming into c5. The c6 pawn is weak. The b file is defended, so the rook never has b8. The knight can come to e5 and win the c6 pawn. Once again, if I turn on the engine, almost a more than +1 advantage for white and a very dominant position. So even after e6, after e3 for white, queen b6 doesn't work. And those are going to be the most common mistakes players make in the Exchange Slav, and those are the patterns you need to remember. Whenever you are tempted to play queen b3 or queen b6, or whenever your opponent plays queen b3 or queen b6, try to remember what I was talking about. Usually the move is not that good and it doesn't threaten that much. Okay, now let's look at the main line of the opening. I want to talk about the patterns in the Exchange Slav. So after d4, d5, c4, queen's gambit, c6, the Slav, takes, knight c3 is the main move, knight f6, bishop f4. In the main line, you don't play the move knight to f3, you want to keep an option to play e3, knight to e2, because the move bishop g4 can be annoying, pinning your knight. So the main branching of the Exchange Slav, if people know what they are doing, is going to revolve around whether white plays knight f3 or knight e2. Knight c6, e3, a6, stopping anything from coming to b5, bishop to d3, bishop to g4, and now if the knight was on f3, the knight would have now been pinned, but now knight g to e2, and of course white now has the option of playing f3 whenever he wants to, and the knights are defending each other. e6, castles, bishop to e7, rook to c1, castles, knight to a4. And this is one of the small advantages white gets in this, what is one of the two main lines in the Exchange Slav. Well, you have the c5 square, which is extremely weak. This kind of resembles white's attacking plans in the minority attack. He's going to be using the c5 square either to plant his rook on c5 after knight c5, bishop c5, rook c5 happens, or he's going to try to play for a3, b4, lock down this structure and use both b6 and c5 to his advantage. So something like knight d7 has to be played, stopping the immediate knight c5, a3, rook c8, b4. And now one of the main ways to play this position for black, if you still want to keep equality, is to remember one of the general rules that if your opponent is playing on the flank, you should strike in the center. So here the main move for black is the move e5, which keeps the position balanced and equal. D takes e5, knight d takes e5, and now black is playing with an isolated queen's pawn, which makes the position very complicated. And if you want to play the Exchange Slav seriously, here is where you should start studying the opening and start studying the patterns. As a brief introduction, I can just say that any piece trades are going to be favorable for white, because as the pieces get traded down, the isolated queen's pawn on d5 is going to become weaker and weaker. Black, on the other hand, needs to keep the pieces on the board, well, except for maybe he would definitely like to trade this bishop off, because this is a monster, same as white would like to keep it. Black wants to keep most of the pieces on the board and start an attack. Otherwise, as I said, white is just going to trade the pieces off and be slightly better. Okay, so this is the setup which white plays with the move knight to e2, delaying knight f3. And knight f3 after cd5, cd5 is one of the two most popular. Okay, so knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, bishop f4, e6, or bishop f5. Both are fine. I would recommend bishop f5. And now we are looking at what's, I think, most commonly played. From this position, there are 4,000 games in the databases. Of those 4,000, 3,900 have had e3 played here, and 100 have had queen b3, which is a mistake, played here. So e3. Now again, more than 4,000 games with e6, e6, bishop d3, takes, bishop d6, takes, castles, castles, rook ac1, rook ac8, a3, a6. Black is copying white not because he's trying to be funny or trying to provoke white, but because these are objectively the best moves. Both sides have played perfectly thus far, which is why, if I turn on the live book, from this position on, and this is unbelievable, rook c2, 39 games, 100% ended in a draw. b4, 13 games, 100% ended in a draw. h3, 11 games, 100% ended in a draw. Knight a4, 11 games, 100% ended in a draw. It's really hard to win this because there is no imbalance in the position. There's no advantage for either side. The most common plan here is going to be rook c2, rook fc1, rook c7, rook fc8. White wants to play b4, black wants to play b5, white wants to play knight a4, knight c5, black wants to play knight a5, knight c4. It's insanely symmetrical, and since it's symmetrical, same plans for both sides. When you try one, your opponent stops it or plays it, which still keeps the position symmetrical and equal. So that's the Exchange Slav. I hope you didn't mind the kind of new format of the video, not going into tons of variations, but trying to talk about plans, traps, patterns, and ideas. In the opening, I hope you managed to learn something. I know I did in the last 5 days since I played Queen b6 thinking I was much better. I had a long time studying the Semi-Slav, and now I think the Exchange Slav, and now I think I understand it pretty well. I would be capable of playing it without making a mistake in the opening. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.